So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bridget Long, and I'm very, very proud to be the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and to welcome you to this very important event. We're so glad that you could join us for our first Ask With Education Forum of the 2023-24 academic year. For those new to the community, the Ask With Forum is HGSE's signature public lecture series designed to stimulate conversations and action among our community and across the education sector on the highest priority issues in education. Through collegial conversation and a respectful exchange of ideas, the Ask With Education Forum reflects the rich diversity of perspectives in our field. Today, we're happy to bring you this important conversation and collaboration with Partnering in Education Research Program, or PEER, which is based at the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University. This amazing program trains incredible doctoral students across the university to do quantitative education research in partnership with school districts and state education agencies. In other words, to do research that is timely, relevant, and useful to educators, leaders, and learners across the field. So keep an eye out for their seminar schedule for the rest of the year. Speaking of timely, I'm so pleased that HGSE is hosting this incredible conversation today entitled College Admissions and Generational Privilege. As we consider the role of education today, questions about who has access to opportunity and who is left out has never been more pressing. HGSE's mission is to prepare education leaders and innovators who will change the world by expanding opportunities and improving outcomes for learners everywhere. And we work to fulfill this mission by putting powerful ideas and evidence-based practices and from research into practice. And today is just one of our many efforts to do just that. Today in the audience, if you look around, it's wonderful to have this full group. We have faculty, students, and advocates for education, but we're also happy to welcome admissions professionals and local college leadership to be part of this conversation as we all grapple with the changing admissions landscape while holding to our commitment to foster vibrant communities whose members come from all walks of life all over the world. We know that deep and transformative learning and teaching and research depend upon a community comprising of people from many backgrounds, perspectives, and lived experiences. Our event today will begin with a presentation by Raj Chetty, and after Raj's presentation, we'll move on to a lively panel discussion with our discussants, and then we'll take some questions from you, the audience. Before I introduce you to Raj, I want to thank my wonderful colleague, Tom Kane, sitting up here up front. Tom is the Walter H. Gale Professor of Education and Economics. He is the Faculty Director of the Center for Education Policy Research, and in his own right, he has written important papers related to higher education access and college admissions. So thank you, Tom, for helping to make today possible. I also want to thank our two discussants, also seated up front. Distinguished social scientist Larry Bobo, who is the Dean of Social Science and the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard. And our own Susan Donarski, the Patricia Albert Graham Professor of Education. Sue is an economist who has long studied issues of access to higher education. So Tom will give fuller introductions for our discussants later on in the program. In the meantime, I'm very happy to welcome Raj, who almost needs no introduction. His groundbreaking and impactful work has been widely cited across academia, media, and policy in the United States and beyond. I take special pleasure in welcoming Raj, who I first met in the late 1990s in the Harvard Economics Department when we were both much younger and still completing our degrees. Even then, Raj stood out as a promising scholar and future star. He is currently the William A. Aikman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and Director of Opportunity Insights, a research collaborative that uses big data to study the science of economic opportunity. The central question that motivates much of his research focuses on how can we give children from all backgrounds better chances of succeeding. It's a question that makes him right at home here at the Ed School and right at home on our stage. So please join me in welcoming Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much, Bridget, for the very warm introduction. Thank you, Tom. It's really a privilege and an honor to be with all of you here today. So as Bridget mentioned, in our research group here at Harvard Opportunity Insights, we're interested in the big picture question of what the drivers are of the American dream. How can we help kids, particularly from lower income backgrounds, rise up in the income distribution and achieve success on a variety of dimensions? Today, I'm going to focus in particular on the role of higher education in helping people achieve the American dream. And I'm going to focus on a very particular slice of the higher education sector, highly selective private colleges, Ivy Plus colleges, the Ivy League, and other colleges like Chicago, Stanford, Duke, and MIT. So when I focus on this group and motivate this by talking about the American dream, people often ask me, how can it possibly be important to study this very small group of colleges that educates only 0.8% of American students among those who attend college? How can it possibly be that changing what happens at these and perhaps a handful of other highly selective private institutions could have big impacts on the American economy as a whole? And I think there's some truth to that logic. There's a limit to how much economic mobility as a whole can be shaped by focusing on what happens at a particular set of institutions. However, when we look at the role that these institutions play in certain upper tail outcomes, measures of influence and power and leadership in society, it starts to become more clear why we might be interested in studying what is happening at these institutions and what their impacts are. So to show you that, in this first chart here, let me show you some data that we've collected on the fraction of people who achieve various markers of success who attended an Ivy Plus college. Again, the Ivy League, Chicago, Duke, Stanford, and MIT. So that group of 12 colleges. You can see that even though only 0.8% of people attend an Ivy Plus college, if you look at the fraction of people at the top of the income distribution who are earning in the top 1% of the income distribution, or the top 0.1%, or who are Fortune 500 CEOs, you can see that the share of people in that group who attended an Ivy Plus college is much larger. 10 times or 15 times larger than their representation in terms of how many students attend overall. If we look at other measures of success, if you just look at overall who attends a graduate school in the United States, 2.7% of graduate school attendees went to an Ivy Plus college. But if you look at what fraction of people who attend an elite graduate school, ranked in the top 10 in various programs, for example, nearly a quarter of students who attend one of those top graduate programs has gone to one of these 12 colleges, showing their outsized influence on that path. As another measure of, a marker of success, if you look at MacArthur Grant recipients, nearly 30% have gone to one of these 12 colleges. If we look at measures of leadership in other parts of society, public service in particular, look at the fraction of senators or presidents or Supreme Court justices who went to one of these 12 colleges, the picture is even more extreme, where if you look at Supreme Court justices, the bar is literally off the charts. 71% of Supreme Court justices in the recent era went to one of these 12 colleges. So what I want to just show you in this first chart is a simple motivation for why we should be interested in these 12 and other similar highly selective private colleges. Even though they're a very small part of the higher education sector, they're potentially extremely important in determining who's leading our companies, who's shaping our laws, who the leading scientists are, and so forth. And insofar as people's backgrounds and experiences matter for the types of decisions they make in those positions of influence, I think what happens at these colleges could have a great influence in society more generally. So that is one piece of motivation for why we focused our efforts on this study. The second motivation comes from this fact here. So I'll describe in more detail the data we used to construct this chart. But what we're showing here is taking that set of Ivy Plus colleges and asking, what is your chance of attending one of those 12 colleges by your parental income where we've divided the income distribution for parents shown on the horizontal axis into 13 different groups. All the way on the far left, people in the bottom 20% of the income distribution with parents making less than $20,000 a year, to all the way on the far right, people in the top 0.1% of the income distribution making more than about $3 million per year. Now, what we've done here, and this is critical, is we are looking at a set of kids who got exactly the same test scores at the end of high school on either the SAT, they got a 1510 out of 1600 on the SAT, so putting you at exactly the 99th percentile of the SAT distribution, or a 34 out of 36 on the ACT. So take a set of kids, all of whom have exactly the same standardized test scores, and ask, what is your chance of attending an Ivy Plus college by parent income? And what you can see, I think, is a striking pattern, which is that if you're from the middle class, say you're making about $70,000, $80,000 a year, your chance of attending an Ivy Plus college, conditional on scoring at the very top of the SAT distribution, is about 10%. But if you're coming from the richest families in America, that number looks like more like 25, 30, maybe even 40% at the very top of the income distribution. And so those two facts, the first on who is in positions of leadership, and this second fact on who gets to attend Ivy Plus colleges, probably naturally sparks in all of your minds two, I think, very natural and important questions. First, do highly selective private colleges amplify the persistence of privilege across generations? One wonders, in light of the charts I just showed you, are institutions like Harvard and other peer institutions taking kids from high-income families, privileged backgrounds, and essentially channeling them in the next generation to positions of influence? And to flip that question on its head, look at the right side of the slide, could these same highly selective private colleges potentially diversify society's leaders simply by changing their admissions policies? Can we change what America's leaders look like simply by what's happening on this college campus and a small number of other college campuses in the United States? So we are going to try to answer that question empirically in this talk. And in order to do that, we're going to focus on two sub-questions, which I think naturally will give us an answer to the overall question we're after. So the first is a question about inputs. Why are students from high-income families more likely to attend highly selective private colleges? Is it that they're more likely to apply? Is it that they're more likely to be admitted? Is it that they're more likely to matriculate, perhaps because they can afford to go to these institutions, whereas kids from the middle class, given escalating tuition, maybe feel like they're not able to? That has been the subject of quite a bit of literature, including by scholars in this room, people like Sue Dynarski, Chris Avery, and others who I think have made quite a bit of progress in understanding these questions, and we're going to bring some new evidence to bear on that. That question in and of itself is not enough to understand the role that these colleges can play in diversifying society's leadership. To understand that, we also need to understand their outputs. That is to say, what is the causal effect of attending one of these colleges on students' post-college outcomes? If all we're doing at these highly selective colleges is simply admitting a certain set of very qualified students who would have gone on to do well, become leaders in society no matter where they went to college, then we might end up changing diversity on our college campuses by changing who we admit, for example. But it might not ultimately have any consequence for the first chart that I started out with in terms of who becomes a senator or who becomes a CEO, et cetera. To really understand that, we need to know whether attending one of these institutions actually has a causal effect in changing a given child's outcomes. And so that'll be the second part of what I focus on. And then I'll put those two pieces together in order to understand the motivating question of what we might be able to do to diversify society's leaders through changes, say, in admissions practices at our institutions. Now, as I was saying earlier, these are questions that we are by no means the first to study. I mentioned folks who've studied the inputs. Other folks like Tom Kane has done work on the causal effects of colleges, as well as well-known work, some of you might know, by the late Alan Kruger, who actually argued that selection effects might be very important, and attending a top college may not actually matter that much for kids' outcomes. So we are going to revisit that prior literature, and what is going to be our angle in coming back to those questions? We're going to take what you might think of as a modern big data approach to studying these questions. And so what that means concretely, building on the kind of approach we've developed at Opportunity Insights and various other contexts over the past decade or so, is linking various sources of administrative data that give us a very granular picture of how these things work. So I'm going to start on the left here and just tell you a little bit about quickly the data that we use here. Many more details are in the paper for those who are interested. A lot of our research starts from the backbone of federal income tax records covering the entire US population over the past 30 years or so. So we take that data and we're able to do various things with it, in particular longitudinal studies, where we can understand how various factors affect kids' outcomes, in this particular case, the colleges that kids attend. We then take that data and link it to information from Pell Grant records, which gives us data on where kids in the US are going to college in combination with other tax forms. So essentially, we're able to build a complete roster of college attendance for everyone in the United States over the past 20 years or so. We then link those federal data to data from the College Board and ACT on everyone's standardized test scores, so that you have information on people's qualifications, at least some part of their qualifications, at the point of college application. And then finally, and most critically, for the analysis that I'm going to show you here, and this is what took a tremendous amount of work over the past 5 years or so, we obtained data from about 400 colleges, internal admissions records, and linked those data to the tax records and the SAT and ACT data and so forth. So you can see who applied to each college, who got in, what their application credentials look like, what their various ratings were, extracurriculars, teacher ratings, were they placed on the wait list, and so on. So as you can imagine, this is an incredibly valuable resource for studying higher education. We think a lot more can come of it in the future. And we're going to show you some initial results here focused on the particular questions I raised at the outset. Okay, so let's start with the first question. Why are students from high-income families more likely to attend these highly selective private colleges? So I'm going to start with this chart that I showed you before, which is just taking the linked data that I just described and simply plotting attendance rates for kids at a given level of SAT scores. And so, the way you want to think about this, if you think back to that chart for a second of kids who had an SAT score of 1510, we could imagine drawing that curve at any given level of SAT scores, right? So I could show you the same kind of curve for people who had an SAT score of 1500, 1490, so forth and so on. So I want to have some simple way of showing you what the patterns look like, averaging across all the different SAT score levels to give you an overall sense of what attendance rates look like, controlling for SAT scores. So what we're going to do, and this is a technique I'll use throughout this talk, is to imagine drawing each of those curves separately, and then I'm going to average those curves, weighting them by the frequency with which those SAT scores appear in the current distribution of students who attend these colleges. So for example, if at Harvard we have more students who attend with an SAT score of 1500 rather than 1300, we're going to put more weight on the 1500 curve than the 1300 curve, okay? So we're going to take that average of all of the curves and then plot the resulting data and divide that by the overall average attendance rate. And so what that's basically going to give you is a picture of how attendance rates vary with parental income, controlling for your test scores at the point of application. So the key point is, as you look from left to right here, all of the kids at different parent income levels, they have exactly the same pre-college academic qualifications as measured by these standardized tests. So what do you see here? Very consistent with that motivating graph that I showed you. There is a sharp uptick in this curve at the top of the income distribution. In particular, you can see that kids from the top 1% of the income distribution are about 80% more likely to attend than the average kid with the same SAT scores. And kids from the middle class, which we're going to define here as people between the 70th and 80th percentile of the national income distribution, that puts you at about the middle of the income distribution for the applicants to these colleges. They're about 22% less likely to attend than the average kid with the same SAT scores. And so if you compare the kids in the top 1% to the middle class, you see roughly a twofold difference or a 2.5-fold difference in attendance rates for kids at the top of the income distribution relative to the middle class, holding fixed your SAT scores. So what does that amount to, just to give you a concrete sense of how big this difference is? Because kids from the top of the income distribution tend to have higher SAT scores on average and apply to these colleges at a higher rate, this twofold difference in attendance rates amounts to quite a few students. If you just work out the arithmetic, in a class of average size for these colleges, 1,650 students, which is the size of the typical Harvard undergraduate class, that amounts to 157 extra students from the top 1%. And to be precise, the way I use the term extra here is if students from the top 1% were attending at the same rate as kids from the middle class with comparable test scores, you would have 157 fewer kids, about 9% fewer kids from the top 1%, families making more than about $600,000 a year at Harvard and other similar institutions. Okay, so the question is, where are these extra 157 students coming from? What is driving that? Before I get into that, I want to show you that this is not just kind of an iron law of college attendance, that you always have this shape. I want to show, as I think, a useful contrast throughout this talk, what these patterns look like at top state flagship institutions, what we might think of as some of our peers in the public sector, places like UC Berkeley, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and so on. And that curve is shown here in the orange. The green repeats what I showed you before for the Ivy Plus colleges, and you can see the shape is pretty different. It's much flatter in particular. It's not totally flat. There is a bit of an upward slope, and I'll come back to that in a second, but it's certainly much flatter than what you see at the Ivy Plus colleges. So what we're going to dig into is what is driving the spike in the green curve and what is driving the difference relative to the orange curve. Okay, so the way I'm going to approach that is with a pipeline decomposition approach. We've got this total of 157 students who we're going to try to explain. And what we're going to do is just a very intuitive logic, step through the process of how you show up on campus here, from applying to being admitted to choosing to matriculate, and figure out how much is coming from these different components of the process that ultimately lead to college attendance. So let's start at the beginning with application and plot application rates by parental income, again, controlling for SAT scores in the way that I just described. So what you'll notice here is that this curve looks pretty flat for the Ivy Plus colleges. It's a little bit upward sloping, but not terribly so. And interestingly, it's actually less upward sloping than the pattern you see at public colleges. So applications, you can immediately see from this chart, can't be explaining the big spike upward in overall attendance rates that we saw in the initial chart. And indeed, again, if you do the arithmetic, it turns out that applications explain about 35 of these 157 extra students from the top 1%, or about 20% of the overall picture. So it's not nothing, but it does not seem to be the central driver of the extra students from the top 1%. So next step in the process, and this, as you can see immediately, is really the key, look at admissions rates. So this is now plotting, again, in the same way, same technique, controlling for SAT scores, conditional on applying for a selected set of Ivy Plus colleges where we have internal admissions data. What is your chance of being admitted by parental income? And here you see this kind of U shape that we started out with, where there's a dip in the middle class and then a spike at the top of the income distribution, in very sharp contrast with the public flagships, which look totally flat across the income distribution. There's absolutely no difference in your chance of admission if you're from the top 1% or the middle class, conditional on having the same standardized test scores at places like Berkeley and Michigan and so on. And so consistent with that picture, admissions do indeed explain a big part of what's going on. I should have noted in passing, in that picture there, I was excluding recruited athletes. I'm going to come back to them in a second. But excluding recruited athletes, 78, or roughly half of this 157 extra students is explained by differences in rates of admission by parental income. Next step in the pipeline, look at rates of matriculation. So if you're concerned about things like financial aid or affordability, you might expect intuitively that these differences would show up in matriculation. Kids get in, but then feel like, I'm not going to be able to afford to attend here. I'd rather go to my local state institution or something like that. You can see that is not a big part of the picture. Matriculation rates at this point, and this is partly, I should emphasize, think because of the expansion of financial aid at many of these institutions, it's not to say financial aid doesn't matter, but at this point, it doesn't seem like that is the key reason that you have more students from high-income families attending Ivy Plus colleges. And so again, if you work out the arithmetic, it turns out that a relatively small fraction, something like 19 of these 157 slots, is explained by differences in rates of matriculation. So what is that last remaining box there? Remember, I skipped recruited athletes. So it turns out recruited athletes are another big part of what is going on here. At Ivy Plus colleges, recruited athletes are much more likely to come from high-income families than low-income families. So this is just plotting the share of students admitted to Ivy Plus colleges and flagship public colleges who are recruited athletes by parental income. And you can see that at the top of the income distribution, something like 12% of kids who are attending colleges like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, et cetera, are recruited athletes. It's much smaller at the bottom of the income distribution. At state flagship colleges, there are two differences. First, the level is much lower. That makes sense intuitively. If you're UC Berkeley and you're trying to fill your football team, you need a much smaller fraction of your student body to be on your football team than Harvard. And second, the curve is much flatter. It's basically perfectly flat. They draw uniformly across the income distribution, unlike the Ivy Plus colleges, which may reflect the types of sports that we're recruiting for here or who we're recruiting, et cetera. Okay, so that mechanically explains the remaining 25 slots. And so this now gives you a picture of where these income disparities and who's showing up on these campuses come from. So the key point that I want to emphasize here is that a big chunk of this disparity in attendance rates is attributable to admissions. If you combine athletic recruitment, which is effectively a choice in the hands of colleges, and non-athletic admissions, that adds up to something like 2/3 of the extra slots for students from the top 1%. So what I want to do next is dig in a little bit more detail in terms of what is going on that's driving those differences in rates of non-athletic admissions. So why is it that kids from high-income families are more likely to get in? One part of it, which is probably already on your mind, is legacy admissions, and it's been in the news a lot lately. And you can indeed see how that plays out. So there are two reasons that legacy admissions matter. So one, which I think is quite intuitive, is that legacy students are much more likely to be from high-income families, precisely because, as I will show you in a second, these colleges are more likely to channel you to the top of the income distribution. If your parents went to Harvard or Yale or Dartmouth, you yourself are more likely to be from a high-income family. And so that's what you see in this chart here. Kids from high-income families are much more likely to be legacy students themselves. So that's part of the reason that legacy admissions leads to an admissions advantage for kids from high-income families. But that's not all of it. There's a second aspect, which we figured out once we had this linked data, which is that the legacy advantage itself in admissions varies greatly with parental income. So if you're a legacy applicant from a high-income family, you are much more likely to get in than if you're a legacy applicant from a lower income family. Just to show you that in this chart here, we're plotting 3 bars. The first bar is, again, controlling for test scores as we're doing throughout this talk. What is your chance of being admitted if you're a legacy student from a family in the top 1%? And at the set of Ivy Plus colleges we're looking at, that admissions rate is incredibly high at 45%. If you're a legacy student from the bottom 95%, you have a 30% chance of getting in. And if you're a non-legacy student, you have a 9.4% chance of getting in. So there's something like a 3 or 4x advantage for legacy students relative to non-legacy students. Now, one natural question you might have in this context is this purely a legacy advantage? Or is it that legacy students have other qualifications? Maybe they have very strong academic records, strong extracurriculars, great recommendations, et cetera. And that's why they're getting it at higher rates. Maybe it's not literally because they are children of alumni. So one nice way that you can assess that is by looking at whether you were admitted to other Ivy Plus colleges where your parents did not attend. Remember, we have data from multiple colleges. If it was actually the case that you were more qualified on all these other dimensions, you might think that if your parents went to, say, Stanford, you'd be more likely to get into Princeton as well. In fact, that's absolutely not the case, as you can see in the set of bars on the right, this really seems like a pure legacy preference that is not transferable across institutions. Okay, so again, when you do the math, turns out legacy preferences explain 47 of these extra slots. But remember, there were 78 extra slots that were due to these admissions preferences. So where is this other remaining chunk coming from? So to investigate that, what we did next is looked at the detailed data on ratings that we have from a number of these colleges to get a better sense of people's application credentials. And so what I'm going to start out with is plotting just academic ratings by parental income, again, controlling for SAT scores. And now I'm going to exclude legacy students from the picture to focus on the other set of students from this point onward. And what you can see first is, you might think, well, maybe the kids from the higher income families are getting it at higher rates because they have stronger academic qualifications, not as measured by the SAT, but they've taken harder classes, gotten higher grades, had a more challenging curriculum, et cetera. So if you look at the fraction of students who get high academic ratings by parental income, you can see that in fact, there's actually basically no difference in academic ratings as judged by admissions officials by parental income once you're controlling for SAT scores. So that doesn't seem to be what is driving this. What is very different are non-academic factors. So things like ratings on extracurricular activities or personal characteristics. Here you see a pattern that starts to look very much like the ones that I've been showing you for overall admissions rates, which look kind of flat, maybe a little bit of a dip in the middle class, and then spike upward at the top of the income distribution. So if you take two kids with the same academic qualifications, the kids from the highest income families are much more likely to have very high non-academic ratings. Now, where is that coming from? A big part of it seems to be coming from just what's happening at the schools that kids attend. Again, take two kids with the same SAT scores. The kids who come from very affluent families are more likely to get very positive teacher recommendations, strong letters of support from their guidance counselors. Again, you see that same shape that I've been showing you repeatedly. Now, critically, this phenomenon is arising at the level of high schools, not at the level of students within high schools. And the way that you can see that is if we have data on the schools that students are applying from, and we've divided them here into 4 different groups: disadvantaged versus advantaged, well-resourced public schools based on College Board indicators, religious private schools, and then non-religious private schools. So here in the Boston area, you might think of a place like Milton Academy or Andover as a place on the far right, a place like Somerville High School as a place on the far left. And what you can see here is that, again, taking kids with the same academic qualifications, the kids who come from a place like Milton Academy or Andover get much higher non-academic ratings than the kids from the public schools. You might also wonder, well, don't these schools also have much stronger academic programs? Could that explain why their students tend to get in at higher rates? And again, the answer turns out to be no. When you look at differences in academic ratings across these 4 different types of high schools, there are basically no differences conditional on SAT scores. So all of this points to the view that these differences in non-academic credentials that are associated with going to certain highly selective elite private schools, basically, are leading to differences in these credentials that give students from high-income families, who, of course, are more likely to attend those schools to begin with, an advantage in the college admissions process. And so that, it turns out, and this is not a mechanical result, it actually turns out you can fully explain what is going on here. That accounts for the remaining 31 slots. And so this gives you a complete picture of what, on average, drives differences in attendance rates. So a lot of it is about admissions, driven by 3 key factors: athletic recruitment, legacy preferences, and non-academic credentials. So I want to make one final point in this discussion of the inputs, which is these data are for the average Ivy Plus college. And that masks the fact that there is a lot of variation across different colleges. And this underscores the value, I think, of looking at the data at a more granular level and not just trying to draw generalizations overall. And so to give you a sense of that, here's data for 4 specific colleges, including some colleges that are represented here in the audience. And you can see, I think some striking patterns. So Dartmouth, you can see, has a very sharp spike at the top. Harvard and Brown are somewhere in the middle. MIT looks like an exception relative to all of the other Ivy Plus colleges. And I think interestingly, from talking with Stu Schmel and others who are involved in MIT admissions, I think my understanding is it exactly reflects the results that I've been putting forth, that MIT does not have legacy preferences, has a weaker form of athletic recruitment, essentially not being in Division I than the other Ivy Plus colleges, and also puts different or less weight on non-academic ratings. And so in some sense, that's the exception that proves the rule. Now, this is data for a small subset of colleges. I've been focusing on this very particular set of 12 Ivy Plus colleges. I just want to note, for those who are interested, that you can look up what these data look like for many other colleges. And the New York Times has put together this nice tool using our data that they actually just released yesterday. And let me just make sure that you can see this clearly. So what you can do here, I'm just going to type in a couple colleges that are of interest, given folks who are in the audience. So here's Wesleyan, where you can see, for Wesleyan, there's this very sharp U-shaped pattern with a sharp dip in the middle class, and then a sharp spike at the top of the income distribution. Again, looking at a couple of other local colleges, here's Boston College. Here, so the pattern that you're seeing here is, while I'm emphasizing the Ivy Plus, you see very similar patterns at other highly selective private colleges that are not formally in the Ivy Plus. And then let me just give you a couple examples from public schools. So here's UC Berkeley, consistent with what I was telling you earlier, looks totally flat across the income distribution once you control for SAT scores. But again, it's useful to look at the data at a college level, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in looking up your own college of interest, you can go to this tool and look at it. Let me type in University of Michigan, which I think is an interesting counterpoint to UC Berkeley, and maybe take away some of these other ones so you can see it more clearly. You can see University of Michigan looks actually a lot more like the private schools rather than the typical public college. And it turns out when you dig deeper and look at why that's happening, a lot of this is about differences in rates of application between kids from lower and higher income families at the University of Michigan, and not about differences in rates of admission, which actually ties very nicely with the work Sue Dynarski has done with the HAIL experiment, trying to get more kids from low-income families to apply to the University of Michigan. I think it's this kind of data that shows at a place like University of Michigan, that's the kind of solution we need to be thinking about. At a place like Harvard or Yale, et cetera, that may not be the key margin to focus on. So that's the power of modern data. In this context, and more broadly, I would emphasize for the students here, this is where we are in the social sciences, far beyond kind of trying to say at a broad level, what's the return to education at the macroeconomic level, can really get down to the ground level and see that it matters which institution you're talking about. Okay, so let me come back here. And you can look at the data for various other local colleges. And let me just point out part of the reason I showed Wesleyan there. It's an interesting case, a little bit different from the other private colleges, where this is plotting application rates. It turns out at Wesleyan, part of the reason you have that enormous spike at the top is not because of big differences in admissions rates. It's because kids from high-income families are much more likely to apply to Wesleyan than kids from the middle class. So again, useful to have that information, thinking about what you want to do at Wesleyan relative to other colleges. Okay, so the remaining few minutes here, I want to more briefly talk about the second question. Does admission to an Ivy Plus college have a causal effect on students' post-college outcomes? And so just to emphasize, I think this question is very important, because in order to understand whether all the factors that I've been talking about here actually matter at the end of the day, we need to understand whether these colleges actually are having an impact on where students end up, or whether it's just about who gets into a given college and they would have done equally well no matter what. So this is an age-old question in the social sciences. It's always a very challenging question in the social sciences because we can't run experiments and randomly have some students admitted to Harvard versus not and compare their outcomes down the road, as much as we might like to do so as social scientists. So what we're going to do instead is try to be creative with the data we do have and try to come up with essentially quasi-experiments in the available data. So one approach we take in this paper, and I'll just describe it in intuitive terms here rather than getting into the econometric details, is essentially to compare students who are admitted versus rejected from the wait list where we think students are likely to have similar application credentials. So what's the logic here? So suppose you've got two students, one of whom happens to play the oboe and the other happens to play the trumpet. And it so happens to be that in the college orchestra that year, you need another oboe player and you don't need a trumpet player. So it so happens then that the student on the right gets accepted and the student on the left gets rejected. From our perspective, that is basically like an experiment where we're going to make the assumption that whether you play the oboe or the trumpet does not have fundamental consequences for your future life outcomes. And so they're basically these idiosyncratic factors that might lead one student to get admitted and another student not to get admitted. So there's a question of whether, this is really a valid experiment. By comparing people on the wait list, are we truly isolating people who are comparable to each other? And I just want to show you how we can get a quick sense of that. We've developed a test, and again, I'll skip the technical details, but the intuition is really very simple. We're going to, again, exploit the fact that we see admissions decisions at multiple colleges, and we're going to ask whether your chance of getting admitted to another college relates to your admissions outcome at a given college. The idea being, if you truly are comparable, and it just so happened that you played the oboe and I played the trumpet, then we wouldn't think that if you got into Yale, it should predict whether you get into Brown or MIT, right? Whereas if it's truly about differences in underlying ability, the person who gets in off the wait list is a stronger applicant than the person who didn't, you might expect that it would be more systematic and you would find these correlations across colleges. So it turns out when you look at the data that based on your admissions decision at a given college, so this is the set of kids who are admitted to a given college, they have about a 50% chance of being admitted to another Ivy Plus college. So that shows you that these colleges are putting weight on similar criteria. If you now hone in on the kids on the wait list, the key point is that the kids who are admitted from the wait list versus the kids rejected from the wait list, they have equal odds of getting into any other place, which basically is the key logic of our experimental design. And then if you look at kids who are rejected from one college, they're highly likely to be rejected from the other colleges as well. So this kind of analysis and various other checks we do basically reassures us that this waitlist comparison is kind of an apples to apples comparison that's going to tell you the causal effect of attending these colleges. And so what do you end up finding? Skipping some details that you can look at in the paper, we basically find that it matters a great deal if you attend one of these Ivy Plus colleges. Your chances of having earnings in the top 1% when you're in your 30s rise from 12% if you went to an excellent state flagship school, a place like Berkeley or Michigan, which is, of course, itself an excellent institution. But from there, going to a place like Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, et cetera, raises those odds to 19%, quite a substantial change, about a 50% increase. If you look in contrast at your average level of income, shown on the far left here, there's a very small impact of attending an Ivy Plus college. So what we're finding, and this is what actually reconciles the results of this study with prior work by Alan Kruger and others, at the mean, there's not that much of an impact of attending these top colleges, but in the upper tail, in terms of income, in terms of your chances of attending an elite graduate school, in terms of your chances at working at a highly prestigious firm, there are enormous differences in your odds of achieving those outcomes if you attend these Ivy Plus colleges. So the bottom line is it really does matter, very consistent with that first slide that I showed you in reaching the upper tail if you attend one of these colleges or not. Last point to wrap up and bring this home to the policy discussion that we're about to have with Sue and Larry and Tom, I want to ask, putting these two pieces together, how would changes in admissions policies ultimately affect student diversity and outcomes, the question that I started out with. So the first point that I want to make here is that, you might think that there's a justification for putting some weight on these other factors that we've been talking about that drive the high-income admissions advantage, things like legacy preferences, athletic recruitment, non-academic credentials, and so forth. Maybe those kids are just stronger and they're going to have better outcomes in the long run, in which case it would make perfect sense to put weight on non-academic ratings, and perhaps kids from higher income families are more qualified in that way. So what we can do with this longitudinal data is put that to the test and ask, is it actually the case when we look at people's outcomes, their chances of reaching the top 1% or working at a prestigious firm or going to a top graduate school, is it actually the case that the kids who have high non-academic ratings or came from legacy families, do they actually do better? And what you can see is the answer is no. There's no difference in outcomes. If anything, it turns out actually legacy students do a little bit worse on outcomes and athletes do a little bit worse than those who don't have those credentials. What is very highly predictive is your academic rating. So your academic rating as assigned by admissions officials is very highly predictive of your chances of reaching the top 1%. You see the same pattern in the context of attending an elite graduate school, working at a prestigious firm. Now, what is driving this academic rating? This relates to the ongoing discussion that I'm sure many of you are aware of about having going test optional. So a key component of the academic rating is your SAT and ACT score. And it turns out that if you just plot kids' outcomes 10 years after college versus their SAT scores, there's an incredibly strong relationship, even when you control for a variety of other factors like parental income, high school GPA, and so on. But if, in contrast, you look at the relationship between those same outcomes and high school GPAs, there's basically no relationship at all. And so what these data strongly suggest is that contrary to some of the prevailing discussion about the issues with standardized tests, there is actually a tremendous amount of information in these tests. Now, I'm not saying that they're perfect by any means. They may have various biases and so forth. But there's clearly, just empirically, it's a fact that there's a lot of signal in these measures. And in particular, a lot of signal relative to the three factors like non-academic credentials and so forth that are the things that are leading to the high-income admissions advantage. So last slide, let's put it all together and think about what we might be able to do going forward in terms of diversifying the class and how that might affect who's in leadership positions in America. So I'm going to show it to you in this way. Let's look at the fraction of students at Ivy Plus colleges who come from the bottom 95% of the national income distribution, families making less than $200,000 a year. That number is currently about 58% at the average Ivy Plus college. We estimate, based on the analysis that I just showed you, that if you were to remove legacy preferences, that number would jump up to 61%. If you further equalized athlete shares by income, so eliminating that tilt in athletic recruitment towards high-income families, would go up to 63%. And if you further contextualized non-academic credentials, basically reducing the advantage that kids from high-income families have in terms of obtaining high non-academic ratings, that number would jump up to 67%. Now, what does that amount to? That's about 144 extra students from the bottom 95% of the income distribution. So I think these three specific changes could have quite a substantial impact. And it would be equivalent to the impact that you could have if you did something different. Another policy proposal one could think about, which is directly putting need affirmative preferences, taking kids from lower income families and directly giving them an advantage in the admissions process instead of shutting off these three advantages which currently exist in favor of kids from high-income families. Now, the key point is that in creating this extra diversity, we would not have any sacrifice, our estimates suggest, in terms of outcomes. If you look, for instance, at the fraction of students from these colleges who would end up working at prestigious firms, that number would, if anything, go up rather than down, showing that by diversifying who is admitted to these colleges, we would indeed end up diversifying who is ultimately in positions of leadership in the United States. And so let me come back then to where I started on the American dream. Our conclusion here is that by changing admissions practices, a small set of colleges in the United States can indeed diversify who is leading America and thereby potentially make the American dream accessible to many more. So thanks so much.
So I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research. And I just wanted to start off by mentioning that many of our ideas about how to improve outcomes in K-12 education as well as post-secondary are wrong. I just can't tell you which of those ideas are wrong. And the only way that we're going to discover which of those ideas are wrong is with the kind of brilliant work that Raj and his colleagues have done to use the data to be testing what I think many folks in higher education had beliefs about. Actually, when you think about it, like, this is one of the most important things U.S. higher education can do for education renewal across the country. It's not just training teachers and training future leaders, as important as that is. It's using the tools of social science to help school systems discover the surprises in their own data. And so this is the peer seminar, and the whole point of the peer program, the Partners in Education Research Program, is to recruit and place Harvard doctoral students inside K-12 and higher education systems to help them learn from their own data. So actually, could I just have the peer fellows stand up, the folks who are here today? So now I want to reintroduce our two panelists. So Sue Dynarski is the Patricia Graham Professor of Education. Her research focuses on understanding and reducing inequality in education. She's studied the effects of charter schools and high school models and financial aid on academic achievement and educational attainment. You may have seen her work in the New York Times, where she writes frequently. Our other panelist joining us up here is Larry Bobo. Larry is Dean of Social Science and W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard. His research focuses on the intersection of social psychology, social inequality, politics, and race. Dean Bobo is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So thank you for joining us today. So Sue and Larry, could you say, like, which of the findings that Raj just presented did you find, most surprising?
Who should go first?
You got to pick.
Sue, why don't you start?
Okay. So I've seen this paper several times now, and each time I get so mad about the whole thing. And so when I have a stroke at a young age, Raj, it's on you. Because, this is what I devote my research to. I'm a first gen. My dad was a Navy sergeant, and then he was a mechanic for the Postal Service. I'm a low-income student who got into Harvard. And I've spent a lot of my life trying to increase opportunities for other low-income students. And Raj has been showing these statistics for quite some time on attendance. How as many students from the top 1% are at the Ivies as from the bottom 60%, right? And people like me and activists got out there and started trying to widen the pipeline. Let's get more kids to apply. Let's get more kids prepared. And the surprise of this work was that it didn't matter, because it wasn't that they weren't applying to the institutions. It's that the Ivies were not admitting them. And the reason why the Ivies don't have low-income and middle-income students is because the Ivies do not want low and middle-income students. So that was the surprise for me. I'll stop there for now.
Wow.
Larry, what did you find most surprising?
Well, I wish I had something as impassioned as what Sue just imparted, but I think I really should begin by thanking and once again congratulating Raj for doing such a masterful job at showing the power of where the social sciences are today in terms of the leverage you can get on answering urgent policy questions when carried out in a sophisticated, thoughtful way that is tied to big questions, but that's carried out systematically without real ideological blinders or lenses on. Two things leaped out at me as I read the paper. The first is on the outcomes side, and that was the really high number of CEOs who hail from these Ivy Plus institutions, and the sort of power and impact on the texture of all of our lives that really does come to represent. Similarly, and I've always thought this ought to be the subject of more public discourse than it is that huge disproportion of Ivy Leaguers on the U.S. Supreme Court, and the need to have more people who have, how shall we put it, real world experience, as opposed to being in these very cloistered Ivy League, Ivy covered halls. Because it really does affect, I think, the texture of decisions and the capacity to make rulings that enormously impact other people's lives because, well, you're not down there with them. The second one is the finding that high-income legacy admits are 5 times more likely to come from one of these colleges than those who are otherwise from a comparable background. And that does seem one of those just outsized impacts on who it is that makes it into these elite institutions. And I don't know, Tom, if this is a point to shift gears in a way, but I almost want to put a heretical notion on the table, because
This is the place for heresy.
okay, I will be heretical, but I do this because I should say I love all my faculty, and Raj is in the social sciences and FAS, so I love Raj, despite what I'm about to say. And so I've also been reading Michael Sandel lately, and as you know, he's got real questions about meritocracy and how we normally gauge meritocratic credentials and standing. And in fact, he thinks we've vastly overvalued college and the sort of things that earmark you for the high end of that higher education track here. And that maybe the real focus of our attention ought to be far more on increasing the dignity of work in general and the rewards to being just a good, productive citizen, a la the type of strike that's about to happen with the United Auto Workers, where if CEOs are entitled to a 40% pay raise over a 4-year period, maybe the rest of us are too. So I don't know quite how to factor that in here, but instead of tinkering so much about with the kind of impact of legacy admits and so on is part of our challenge as institutions of higher learning, as propagators of ideas, as influencers of public discourse, to really foster a whole new discussion about meritocracy, the value of work, and what the returns ought to be for anyone who's a good, serious working citizen. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, no. So
I wanted to say something quick, and Tom, I was asking Tom's permission, but he didn't give it, so I'll say it anyway. So I say, why not both? Right? Isn't that a meme?
Sure.
Right? Why not both? Right? So why not increase the value of the dignity of work? I was a union organizer before I became an academic, right? So unions are one of the key, besides education. Unions and education are the keys to economic mobility in this country. So that's about the middle, right? But who runs our country matters a lot. And so I would like to see both happen is my goal.
So I don't want to start with legacy admissions because I feel like it's almost too easy to oversimplify and see the challenging results that Raj presented in sort of a black and white scenario. Instead, I want to start with the role of non-academic ratings. So it's been well documented that SAT scores are related to family income. And partially because of that, institutions over the last 15 years or so have been spending more and more time building resources to focus on non-academic factors, to do holistic reviews, to pay careful attention to the essays and the letters of recommendation and so forth. And yet, just as with legacy admissions, such non-academic factors turn out to be an important contributor to that top 1% admission advantage. Like, what's the implication of this? Like, should we be encouraging private institutions to go back to more of a formulaic approach? Like what, with less, not more holistic review? How should we be thinking about this? This is a question for all, but actually I'll give Raj a chance to get started.
Yeah, so Tom, I think everything you said makes sense. So what we're seeing in the data, as I showed toward the very end, is that SAT scores, despite the fact that they may have biases, are in fact quite highly predictive of outcomes. And I actually think it's all the more surprising given that there might be, certain well-documented biases. So for example, kids from high-income families are more likely to take the test multiple times. Something Josh Goodman has shown leads to higher max SAT scores for kids from higher income families than lower income families. Well, what that suggests is, throughout the talk, I was comparing two kids with, say, the same SAT score, 1,500 from a low income and a high income family. Really what we should be doing is comparing the kids who have a 1,500 from a low income family with, say, 1,550 from a high income family, right, to account for that kind of thing. And that would only accentuate all the points that I'm making, that it's, an even sharper gradient than what we're seeing in some of the charts that I've been showing. So, what I would emphasize is, I think some of this debate in the public discourse has gone the way of, given that there are certain flaws in standardized tests, we should instead shift to a completely different set of criteria. As we're seeing in these data, that can lead to a whole other set of biases that one should worry about. And so my perspective is more, we should figure out how we contextualize things like SAT scores, try to fix the limitations they may have. And to be clear, and you use the word formulaic, I'm not suggesting that we do a totally formulaic admission strategy. We do see that if you look at admissions offices' academic ratings, even above and beyond the part predicted by standardized test scores, that is predictive of students' long-term outcomes. So there's something that people are reading in these admissions files that are not captured by SAT scores that is in fact a very valuable signal. It's just that it's those academic factors that are highly predictive, not the non-academic factors, which seem to be getting a fair bit of weight.
Sue and Larry, do you have more to add on that?
So, when I talk to admissions folks about this topic, they feel kind of like their hands are tied because, you got to fill the lacrosse team and you got to fill the orchestra and so the slots are set aside. And the thing is, who plays the oboe and who plays lacrosse is very class linked in the United States. So when you say SAT is biased, everything else in the admissions process is worse. So if we take out the SAT, we're now weighting it towards the other things, the letters of recommendation, the internship I had at the New York Times in my summer of my sophomore year. All this stuff is even more biased. So I have been a lonely voice in the world of education research, of education schools, saying that basically we should be hanging on to the test scores. If anything, they are a way for us to find low-income students, disadvantaged students who otherwise might not make it into the Ivy League. And, I was at University of Michigan before this. For 13 years, I was at Michigan, and that was the flat line on the recruited athletes thing. Last I checked, Michigan had a pretty good athletics program. My partner is a Wolverine. He's an alum, so I get to hear all the time about how the teams are doing. It would be possible to eliminate a lot of that advantage that we've put in place, because essentially we've set aside slots for high-income students, the people who have a rowing program at their school, right? Who have a lacrosse program at their school. So I think we need to make some changes on the non-academic stuff, and I think we need to use test scores as a way to find high-achieving, underrepresented kids.
I said it was a place for heresy. Larry.
No, I have no heretical thoughts on that one. So.
Okay. Okay, so we could go one by one through all the admission criteria that colleges use. Investigate the relationship to family income and drop those that are most related to family income. However, Raj and his colleagues did just that, and based on that kind of approach, we'd be losing legacies, non-academic factors, and recruited athletes. Now, presumably, there's some benefits to having an oboe player, to having a crew team, and perhaps even to having some students around who know and understand and cherish, like the institution's traditions. So a different approach, which Raj got to at the very end, but he went over it quickly, would be to keep some of those individual preferences and then try to offset them with more of a need positive, need affirmative admission policy. Not need blind, just the opposite. Need positive. So providing an explicit bonus in the admission process to higher need families. What do you think about that sort of as a different way to think about this problem?
I'm happy to say something quick. So I certainly think, as we showed with that last bar on that chart, that's another way that you can make progress here by putting a thumb on the scale, so to speak, for kids who've overcome adversity, come from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds. I think there are data-driven ways that one can do that, not just using parental income, but actually using data on the high school, the neighborhoods that kids grew up in. We've put out some data, not just by college, but by neighborhood, in something that we call the Opportunity Atlas on chances of upward mobility across different neighborhoods in the US. And you could imagine, saying a kid who's done really well from one of these neighborhoods where you've seen historically very few kids succeeding, that could be, it could make sense to give that kid an advantage in the admissions process, and that would countervail some of these patterns that we're seeing here. Now, I will note, if you take that to the limit and give everyone an advantage in the admissions process, then that amounts to giving no one an advantage in the admissions process, right? So at some level, you have to think carefully about there's going to be a limit to that.
So that's part of what I was thinking about here, and you'll pardon me, but most of my data on this subject comes not so much from your paper, Raj, though it should have. It's from reading the Supreme Court opinions of late. And as I think about the recent Supreme Court ruling, I think the argument is Harvard was admitting about 30% of an admitted class had some legacy tie. If I'm wrong, Rakesh, throw something at me. But I think that was the rough number. And maybe this is an arena in which one needs a quota, and the quota should be a fairly low one. Not that legacy admits have no place, not that legacy admits are invariably a bad or negative thing, because I'm sure it does have various benefits for the institution, especially if you think of the institution as being connected to people over a full life course, not merely during the 4 or 5 years that they're actually in residence as a student and contributing to the life and longevity of the institution. But that maybe that's some of the trade-off as well, not necessarily weighting these other factors, but really being very self-conscious about how far you go toward legacy-weighted admissions.
And so, I think what Raj's data demonstrate, so the legacy kids have lived, on average, some of these most advantaged lives of all of these applicants. They don't need a thumb on the scale, right? So you take the thumb off the scale, they'll still get in at very high rates because they have had privileged lives and they've had the academic preparation and they have been groomed to be in these rooms, right? So, but they're getting affirmative action on top of that, right? That's what the thumb on the scale is for the people who have the most privilege in this process. So we don't have to have a quota to make sure we have lots of legacy kids running around. They've just let in the ones who are most qualified. Don't let in the ones who are not. Crazy. I know.
There you go.
They get me up here to say crazy things.
Yeah. So for a long time, need-based or what's called class-based admission rules were positioned as alternatives to race-conscious admissions. And there's been lots of research suggesting that need-based or class-based admissions are not nearly as effective as race-based admissions in generating diversity. So many of those who supported race-conscious admissions opposed class-based admissions. Now, has that trade-off changed now that the Supreme Court decision has sort of changed this? So, do you see a different debate now happening over the potential role of class-based or need-based admissions?
Yeah, so I was actually, this is one of the questions I would like to ask Raj, in effect. I mean, legally, it certainly has put things in a different institutionally viable context. And I guess I have always accepted the wisdom, without having done the work to verify it, that you can't accomplish what you want with a race-based system with a purely class-based system. And does your work suggest that presumption is flawed, that we can get most of what we want without paying attention to race in terms of at least underrepresented minorities?
I think your understanding is exactly right, Larry. So income is, of course, correlated with race in America. Yeah. And so that's why there's some relationship between the two. If you have need-based affirmative action, you will create more racial diversity to some extent. But there's nowhere strong enough a correlation to replicate the racial diversity that you had in prior years when you had race-based affirmative action. And so that's part of, it's related to what I was saying earlier, Tom, that when we think about need-based affirmative action, I think it's important not just to think about income directly, but other measures of context. Mm-hmm. So for instance, neighborhood environments, as we've shown in some of our earlier work, where you grow up has a tremendous effect on your life outcomes because of access to schools, who you're influenced by, and so forth. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, America is incredibly segregated by race at the neighborhood level. And so taking neighborhood level adversity into account is naturally going to further correlate with race. Mm-hmm. And that is an approach. Actually, Yale University just announced that they're going to start to incorporate this Opportunity Atlas data that I was mentioning. That's a way to make further progress on these issues. I still think, though, it's an empirical fact that you're not going to get back to the level of racial diversity that you had in prior years. So they're not a one-for-one substitute, definitely not. Yeah.
Most poor people are white.
Yes.
Right, that's what he just said, but I'm saying it differently.
Yep.
And so when you have income-based, anyway. So, we've got strong evidence at this point, I think, about how to get more low-income kids to apply. So, and I've helped to produce some of it. At University of Michigan, we pushed out to low-income kids a promise that if they got into Michigan, they would have free tuition and fees for 4 years. And we were able to do this because they knew they were low income and Michigan had generous aid, and they were going to get that anyway. You saw the matriculation figures, right? None of that was contributing in any way to the sort of inequality, because the key is getting them to apply at the flagships, and it sounds like at Wesleyan and other places. So if you want advice about how to get them to apply, we have good social science on how to make that happen. What we don't have control of is what the admissions offices do. That's not public policy, that's private policy, right? So if you want more low-income students, we know how to get them to you, to get highly qualified students who are admissible and who will succeed. If an institution doesn't want them, we can't do anything to change that.
So I'm about to open up to audience questions, but I just wanted to give Raj a chance to clarify a point that he made at the beginning, and you made it again at the end, but I bet it flew over the head of a lot of the folks in the audience, and that is, you and your co-authors write, we caution that changes in admissions policies at highly selected private colleges cannot by themselves increase economic mobility substantially. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. I appreciate you raising that, Tom. So that just comes back to the simple numbers that I showed at the very beginning. The very first number I showed, that only 0.8% of students in the United States who go to college attend an Ivy Plus college. That arithmetic means that no matter what you do at these colleges, even if they were 100% low-income, middle-income students, just mechanically, if you ask what is going to happen to the overall rate of economic mobility in America, by that I mean the average low-income kid, what are their chances of reaching the middle class or beyond? There's just a limit to how much you can do with colleges of relatively small size. What really matters there, and this connects with the discussion about state flagships and community colleges, places like the City University of New York that educate enormous numbers of students, it's equally important to understand how we amplify the impacts of those colleges in order to increase economic mobility more broadly. And in fact, that is the subject of our next research paper using these data, trying to figure out how you can increase economic mobility at those institutions. I think that will matter more in terms of numbers. But, and coming back to something Sue raised at the beginning, the reason I think we should still be quite interested in the Ivy Plus colleges is they provide a unique pathway, as I was showing you here, to the very upper tail positions of influence in society, and that matters.
Right, and there was another reason why it doesn't work that I bet folks didn't notice, which is a little counterintuitive, and that is there's not much impact on mean earnings.
Exactly.
That even though there are big impacts in the upper tail of attending one of these institutions, there had been prior research that suggested there wasn't a gigantic impact on mean earnings, and you're replicating that too. So led people previously to say, well, admission to these elite Ivies doesn't matter so much because it's not really moving mean earnings very much. What you're pointing out is, yeah, it matters, at least especially at the top of the income distribution in certain professions and graduate schools. Okay, so why don't we open up to questions from the audience? Yes, Peter.
Raj, thank you so much for a great presentation. Something that's running in the foreground of my mind is why don't we just expand the sizes of schools like Harvard? This is something that I've been working on with my colleague Kent Smetters. When you look at the data over the past 25 years, you see that our peer institutions at Publix have increased by about 50 to 60%. We've increased at the Ivy Plus institutions by less than 7%, right? So why isn't that the first order thing for us to do, especially given the large amount of resources that we have and even the space that we have too?
Yes, that too, right? So the Ivies are sitting on enormous quantities of money. You know, their endowments have been produced by centuries of collecting wealth and from tax advantages as well. And they're not expanding access. You know, California's system grew as our country grew and as more and more people went to college. Harvard's pretty much the same size as it was in 1920. So yes, the institutions need to grow. That would be a very easy way to increase representation at these institutions. And I think it's a moral imperative. I mean, the other thing we need to do is to make more fantastic institutions. So like pour money into the HBCUs, right? Turn them into their own Harvards, right? So the reason why it matters so much about getting into Harvard is because the next set of schools down has so many fewer resources. So spread the wealth out.
I agree with Sue. I think one thing I would add, and there are many college leaders here in the audience who might have a different view about how much money they actually have to throw around. But, universities do many things in the United States. Educate students, I think, is one important part of the mission. But of course, research and various other things that are also quite expensive, right? And so I think from an economic point of view, we need to think about how universities are financed and think about the incentive structure. It could be about changes in federal policy,
Yes.
As much as, literally just Harvard in and of itself deciding to double the number of seats, which might.
No, I would agree. I would just accentuate that point briefly so we can get to the next question, which is that we have really witnessed, and you've seen in particular in a state like California, a huge disinvestment in higher education over the last 3 decades. And the privileged position it was in, as I'll personalize it and get emotional about it. When my older brother went to college, you could get a student loan to buy a stereo or a car, right? I mean, you couldn't do that today. Every dime you had would have to cover your tuition, room, and board, and you would still take on an enormous amount of personal debt. And that's because of a huge shift in how we, as social policy, have decided to finance higher education. So that's part of the issue here.
Thank you.
So yes, next question.
So an important finding you found is that the leadership positions in US places like in US is largely from these colleges. So it's important to find out who are the students from those colleges again who are getting into the leadership positions. It's not all. So a few of them are getting from these colleges, and it's important to see who are they and how they are behaving. In that context, is it that the students who got non-academic credits like higher, they are the students who are getting into leadership positions? How they are connected actually? Because it's giving an overall position, but it's important to understand that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So we're not able to directly look at leadership positions, because there are only so many Supreme Court justices and senators, and you have to wait a long time till you can directly look at those outcomes. But insofar as, we can look at the outcomes we're able to measure, which are often pathways to those kinds of leadership positions, working at a very prestigious firm, reaching the top of the income distribution, attending a top graduate program. The data I showed at the very end showed that these other factors, the non-academic credentials, legacy status, athletic recruitment, are not predictive or in fact negatively related to your probability of succeeding on those measures. And what is predictive are these academic ratings and SAT scores and so forth. So you're absolutely right that it's not every student who reaches those positions. Insofar as we're able to predict it, it seems like the academic factors that are being weighed in the admissions process matter. But I think more generally, trying to understand better how you identify those students and support students in achieving that potential is exactly the right way to think about it.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Farouk Martins. I was struck by an article I read making an argument that if you take away privileged admission, you might inadvertently be cutting all the money that the parents and the grandparents and all the endowments are contributing to universities, which may affect poor students that are coming in. So what do you say to that?
So you're saying, I think another way of saying what you're saying is there may be other benefits to legacy admissions, and that in the form of financial contributions to the school that would be foregoing.
Yeah. And I think that's a totally valid concern. The way that I would approach that empirically is in two ways, I think. So one, look at the experience of colleges that don't have legacy admissions in recent years, like MIT, which I think is doing okay despite not having legacy admissions. Or places like Amherst or Johns Hopkins that have recently removed legacy admissions and I think have continued to fundraise. And I think the reason for that from an economic point of view is that the wealth distribution in the United States is so skewed that the fraction of people who make donations that I think actually matter at the scale of these institutions is a very small number of people relative to the number of legacy students who are being admitted. And so I agree with you that, in theory, that's a valid concern. But my guess is as we accumulate empirical evidence, as more colleges might reduce or remove legacy preferences, my instinct, given the data we've seen, would be that that effect is not enormous.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Mason Quintero. I recently graduated from Amherst College, and I'm beginning a career community organizing with college students to lobby administrators for changes on equitable admissions and combating career funneling into consulting, finance, and tech. My question for you guys is, through conversations with admissions officers, I find it unlikely they're going to say teacher recommendations, guidance counselor recommendations, whether they play the oboe or trumpet is not going to matter. So what would it look like to contextualize non-academic preferences in a way that would make it more equitable for students across class lines?
I mean, University of Chicago, we've been lauding MIT because University of Chicago manages to pull this off as well. So University of Chicago doesn't have legacy admissions, and it's got a much flatter relationship between income and enrollment. So this is doable. It's about changing. Yeah, I don't think actually the admissions officers have control over this, right? This is an institution-wide decision about what its values are. Does the institution value having people from underrepresented groups at the school more than having an oboe player? This is a value judgment, right? You've got one student who's a low-income student, fantastic academically, another student who's a legacy, somebody from the top 1%, fantastic academically. They also play the oboe. which you choose reflects your values.
But Sue, would you have to choose, like, in effect, like squeeze out the non-oboe playing rich kids? Like, so like by doing the simulation that Raj was doing at the end, where he says, okay, what happens if we kept some of these things? Wouldn't have to keep them all, but like...
I think there has to be some cost to it. So your orchestra might not be the best one in the country, it might be the second best. You might lose some more football games, more lacrosse games. So I assume there would be some, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't. I think it may take several centuries of accumulating data to be able to estimate the oboe player effect and the lacrosse player effect. Yeah. So your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild can give my great-great-great-great-grandchild a stroke at that.
But the general point is there may be ways to, if you say we value these non-academic credentials, not necessarily because they're predictive of long-term outcomes, but somehow perhaps maybe they're predictive of, the vibrancy of campus life. But we recognize there's some negative downsides to that, and so we'll be adding in this need-based thing that would offset at least a chunk of it.
This would have to be this is a difficulty because many institutions proudly are need blind. And this requires them to not be need blind.
To be need positive.
Yes.
Yeah.
The one other quick thing I would add there, Tom, is usually when people think about need, they're thinking about the lower end of the income distribution. But the pattern you see in many of the figures I was showing you is this U shape where it's really the middle class that's being squeezed. There are a number of kids who have high SAT scores, lots of good qualifications. They're coming from middle class or upper middle class families, and they're not able to distinguish themselves on one side or the other, that they've really overcome tremendous adversity or that they play the oboe or a legacy, et cetera. So, I think that may be a limit to that.
Yes, next.
Hi there, I'm Victoria, visiting from Stanford. So Raj, David Grusky says hello. This is a question for everybody. I think implicit to the talk and conversation today is the function of a college degree in our world today. And that is largely of a credential, of a signal, and this is especially true of elite college degrees. And Max Weber in Economy and Society wrote something to the effect of higher education degrees are the new aristocracy. In that under an aristocracy, we inferred people's capabilities from their paternal last names. Now we infer people's capabilities in large part due to their college credential. And when I say we, I should specify to say, I mean the guarantors of the Rhodes Scholarship, Supreme Court clerkships, McKinsey recruiters, all these power brokers in our society are the ones that are using these college credentials as heuristics for hiring and appointing to positions of power, as you showed. And my question to all of you is, well, what do we make of this? To an extent, yes, these college degrees are heuristics. They're not perfect, but they're useful. They condense information. But can we perhaps move to a more accurate heuristic that is more holistic of somebody's life and experiences and a better judgment of merit, so to speak, as Professor Bobo, you mentioned earlier?
No, that's Michael Sandel would enjoy the line of reasoning that you're putting on the table here, because that's exactly the point. As he argues, we've gotten to a point where meritocracy, as measured by completion of a college degree and getting the highest prestige college degree being the penultimate demonstration of being meritorious, creates one of the core problems with the extremity of inequality we've come to tolerate in our political and social lives, where the winners develop a degree of hubris based on their presumed rightful entitlement to much, much more of all the things that matter than everyone else, whereas those who don't have that degree are saddled with humiliation and a sense that they are the losers, and that's all they are entitled to. And the discussion clearly, if we're really, and I know this is part of what motivates you, Raj, is this concern with how to find antidotes to the extremity of inequality that we're witnessing in this society, the stagnation of mobility, and the political and social consequences of us that are fraying the social order all about us. So that is one of the huge questions. So thank you.
If I can just add, I don't disagree with that argument at all, but I would come back to something Sue said earlier, that it is not in tension with the idea that we could also do something in higher education to make a difference. My own view from studying these questions from many different angles is that there are many places we can make a difference in the K through 12 education system, in the degree of segregation in our neighborhoods, in how employers hire and assess merit. And I think there's a danger in any one group saying it could be this other group that makes a change. I think everyone can contribute to making a difference here.
And I'll just quickly add, the stakes are so high because wealth and income inequality in our country is so enormously high. At a historically high rate. And so the goodies you get from being at the top are much, much bigger than they used to be. And those are a function of public policy, tax policy, for example, right? So there are things we can do to change what the payoff is to being at the top, just like we can improve the quality and the number of non-elite institutions so that falling out of the elite doesn't make so much of a difference to people's lives.
Thank you.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our panelists. And so I hope we'll see many of you again at future peer seminars where we're doing this sort of work and featuring this kind of work, working with administrative data to try to answer policy questions. I would just ask the audience to let the speakers who have another engagement that they need to go to quickly exit before everybody else exits. Sort of like on an airplane, like great, thank you.
Thank you.